So today's lesson is going to be on political factors. We're still part of the PEST factors chapter. We did social factors last week. Now, political factors, before we start, I've just got to say that we have to try to remain neutral in order to answer questions well. When people sort of talk about politics, they normally have some fairly strong beliefs, and they're very good at stating lots of arguments to support what they're saying, and not so good at considering or accepting arguments against what they believe. And that just doesn't come across well as a business studies answer, because if a business studies question asks you to consider something, they're expecting a balanced arguments for and arguments against, not a one-sided argument, because that's just going to score you maximum half marks in a question. You can say what you lean as your conclusion, but throughout the essay, you would have to be balanced. Also, some people might not really have much interest or knowledge about politics, but that's not important either. This isn't a politics course, it's a business studies course. This chapter isn't very long, and it's just got a few generic topics which are politically related, but they don't have any countries or political parties attached to them. And you'll see when we get into them now, they're just a few things just to understand generically. Okay, so there's instability. If you think about the world today, you've got some instability going on in America with Black Lives Matter. You've got some instability in Brazil with how they are currently dealing with the pandemic. And you've got some instability in Hong Kong, where there's lots of protests and demonstrations and a bit of civil unrest. And all of those things just cause a less stable economic and legal framework to work within. So it's very risky if you wanted to start a business in one of those countries now, because you might set a lot of things up and then the value of the money drops dramatically and you've lost out on a lot of money just through sort of exchange rates. Laws might change because of this instability. There might be lockdowns, there might be riots, protests, demonstrations, boycotts, all these different things which could just hurt your business. It's a very high risk thing to move into or to trade with or to set up a business in a politically unstable country. Okay, so some people will, and with great risks comes great rewards potentially, but also there's a greater risk of bankruptcy. Then we move on to national security. So if you think back to 9/11, traveling on planes was very different before then. Now there's a higher level of security. You need longer to travel as a to get through security. Into an hour flight, you might have to get to the airport a couple of hours before, and that's just as a foot passenger. There's similar sorts of restrictions on importing and exporting things from countries. So a cargo plane or a cargo ship or a cargo lorry, all these different things are going to be inspected a lot more. There's going to be a lot more sort of red tape, bureaucracy. It's going to make things slower and more expensive to deal with in another country. And there might even be some flat out restrictions on certain products. Okay, so if you are a business, you have to consider all of those things. It's going to factor in extra cost, extra delays, and extra difficulties along the way. Okay, so you've got to consider that. Then there's major trading partners. So if we go back to the Hong Kong example, if you decided to trade with Hong Kong, then you are going to potentially enrage your China and stop your chances of trading with them. If you already are trading with them, they might not like it and they might want to take a step back. You have got to think about certain countries being boycotted. For instance, very few people will trade with North Korea, and very few people will trade with anyone who does trade with North Korea. And you get the idea here that you've got to consider from a political standpoint who you trade with, because it's going to affect who else you can trade with and how everyone else views you. Okay, so that's one of the things about the EU. It sort of groups everybody together as a single sort of unit, which means that you could trade within the EU freely. So it reduced all these different tariffs and charges and things, and also sort of a lot of the political bureaucracy that went along with it. Okay, so there's a couple more. It's got changes in government. So pretty much every country has got multiple political parties trying to get into power, and they have different priorities. Certain ones might be make things easier or cheaper for businesses, and some might make things more expensive and difficult for businesses if they want to increase, let's say, the NHS or other services, council services. Then it might mean that businesses for profit have to pay higher taxes, or it could work the other way around. Okay, so you've just got to be aware of that, how changes in government are going to have those changes. So if you were setting up a business in the USA, you should be aware that there's an election in November, and there's going to potentially be a new party in power, and they might have very different views. So you need to sort of consider that when starting your business. And the last one we're going to look at is pressure groups. So the examples given here is pressure groups against tobacco, alcohol, and gambling industries. But sort of more sort of current and up to date, there's pressure groups against things which go against sort of Black Lives Matter, or there's pressure groups trying to get people to stop trading with China because of what they believe happened at the start of the pandemic. And so these pressure groups, even though they are not sort of lawmakers, they can convince lawmakers to change things, because if a big enough group decides that they want something and they get to vote on who is in political power, then whoever's in political power is generally going to try to satisfy their needs where they can. Okay, so the typical examples: tobacco, alcohol, and gambling. They are restricted and very highly taxed and regulated. So, for instance, if we look at tobacco in Britain, not only is it very highly taxed, they are very restricted in how they can advertise. They used to be able to advertise on TV. They used to be able to advertise in magazines. None of this is allowed anymore. They used to be sort of out in the open. They'd be behind the counter in a lot of shops, but they'd still be out in the open and visible. But now they're behind closed shutters so that nobody's going to impulse buy them. And they have to have all these warnings on them. So there's a lot of restrictions in place there. They'll still find ways of advertising. For instance, they can sponsor certain sporting events and get their name on things, but even that's being restricted in a lot of ways. And the similar sort of thing for alcohol and gambling. So if you're in that industry, then these pressure groups are making your life a little bit more difficult as a business, and you need to sort of be able to be aware of it and react and adapt to it. Okay, so that's the whole of the chapter on political factors there. There's not much to it, like I said. So if you make some notes on that, perhaps if you got this printed out, you can sort of annotate each of these paragraphs with a couple of examples. And if you watched a couple of videos I link, and that's everything you've got to do for today.